Today, we speak to Neil Hauer, a journalist and analyst based in the country of Georgia. His work focuses on the Syrian conflict, particularly Russia's role, the politics and conflict of the South Caucasus, and violence and politics in the North Caucasus, particularly Chechnya. He has conducted regular field work in these areas. He's been on the ground covering some of the violence and danger there. He has previously served as senior intelligence analyst at the SecDev Group in Ottawa, Canada. He has consulted for the European Union and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe on radicalization and security. Hauer and I spoke about the conflict that is a few years old now, happening between Azerbaijan and Armenia. He breaks down the complexities of that war. We talk about his past work, his current situation on the ground, and how reporting has changed over the years in these areas. Hope you enjoy the show. Thank you so much for listening. Neil Hauer, thank you so much for joining Exit Strategy today. Like we were just talking about before, I wanted to have you on. I see that you had some pretty interesting career background, writer, journalist, reporter on the Caucasus, currently based in Armenia. I'm curious if you could. I'm happy for you to introduce yourself, and maybe that might give us a segue into some of your work and what you've been covering.
Sure. So just as a brief background, I guess, how I got to where I am now. So I studied in undergrad. I focused largely on the former Soviet Union. And then out of that, I ended up becoming more specialized and was really drawn to the Caucasus, as this small region at the crossroads of a lot of things, but with so much different culture, history packed into a small area. Ended up doing my master's degree, largely focused on the region, living in Russia for a year as part of that, learning Russian. And then about 4.5 years ago now, I finished up one job I was doing in Canada, and I moved out to Georgia to try out freelancing, and it ended up working out pretty well. And so, long story short, here I am 4.5 years after that. First 2 years lived in Georgia, then about 2.5 years ago moved down to Armenia, and have been here ever since.
Fascinating. I mean, it's a really interesting trajectory. And I imagine in the midst of your freelancing career, you found yourself in the 2020 Karabakh War, right? This is one of the first topics I really wanted to get your take on. I know. So this podcast is called Exit Strategy. It's about geopolitics, conflict, illicit trade, all sorts of the cool, interesting nuances of our geopolitical underworld. The 2020 Karabakh War has been on my radar for some time, and it's been covered by many folks, but many people who listen to this podcast may be unfamiliar. So it's great to have an expert. It's great to somebody who's been there, who didn't maybe explicitly go there because of this conflict. So if you're cool with it, I'm happy to start there. Maybe you can give us or give listeners who are not so familiar with that specific situation a little bit of the history leading up to the conflict, maybe how your reporting fit into all of that.
Sure. Luckily, I've gotten pretty good at giving the 3-5 minute spiel on the background of this incredibly complicated conflict. But
you can take longer if you'd like.
Yeah. No, I think I can boil it down pretty effectively at this point.
Okay.
So let's leave out the older stuff. Let's put this. Let's say that the modern roots of the conflict go back to the late Soviet Union, and so essentially they're in the Soviet Union. In the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic and the Azerbaijani Soviet Socialist Republic. There were two of the main territorial groupings of the South Caucasus then, along with Georgia. And in 1988, protests broke out both in Armenia and in a small part of the Azerbaijan Soviet Republic, known as Nagorno-Karabakh. And this was a majority ethnic Armenian area that for one reason or another had been placed within as an autonomous unit within Azerbaijan, within the Azerbaijani Soviet Republic. And in February 1988, the calls began to emerge for the Karabakh Autonomous Oblast, as the province is called, to be handed over, to be united with the Armenian Soviet Republic instead of the Azeri one. And so this launched pretty quickly into a pretty nasty bout of ethnic cleansing. First on the Azerbaijani side, with pogroms against the Armenian population in Baku, the now capital of first it was Sumgait in February 1988, and then became, essentially back and forth ethnic bloodletting and ethnic cleansing, let's say for the next about 2.5, 3 years, as the Soviet Union was, entering its death spiral in 88, 89. And then once it gets towards the end of 1991, the situation's still not resolved, and the force that was restraining anyone, the Soviet army, ceases to exist. And what we get is a full-scale war between Azerbaijan on one side, and then the Karabakh Armenian, backed by the new Republic of Armenia forces on the other side. And for a variety of factors, Armenia and Karabakh, despite being outnumbered and on paper, the weaker force in this first conflict, they win and emerge victorious. And when the ceasefire is signed in 1994, Armenian forces control not only Karabakh itself, the former province there, but they also control 7 regions of Azerbaijan proper surrounding it that they captured over the course of the fighting. And so this situation largely holds for the next 26 years, this very tense, very fortified front line where, you have dozens killed from each side just about every year in exchanges of fire. And then you have the one major flare-up, the biggest flare-up was in April 2016, what's known as the 4-day war, where, it was essentially full-scale fighting then. So Azerbaijan, in this time, in between the two wars, they spent their oil revenues took off, and they invested, 15 or 25 billion of their new oil revenue into rebuilding their army, purchasing modern military equipment and everything. And so this all culminates on September 27th last year, when Azerbaijan suddenly launches a full-scale assault on Karabakh. And this time, with for the first, something that was absent in the Caucasus for the last 30 years now Turkey's involved, and Turkey helped Azerbaijan to a good degree militarily, and also, diplomatically, politically, backed them fully. And over the course of 44 days last fall, Azerbaijani forces, backed by Turkish drones especially, won a decisive victory over Armenian forces, and ended up taking about 3/4, 70% of the territory in and around Karabakh that Armenian forces had held since 1994.
I see. Yeah, that's wow. Okay. Tell me what it was like as you relocated to this area, and you were freelance reporting. Were you freelance reporting on some of the political situation surrounding this, or did it kind of take off because of the new conflict that erupted in what was that, 2014, I believe you said?
Yeah, I mean, I was when I moved out here, I was very steeped in the politics and all the various conflicts in the region, of which there's been quite a few in the last 30 years since the breakup of the Soviet Union. With in the north part of the Caucasus, the two Chechen wars, 2008, the Russia-Georgia war, and some various lower level insurgencies and other conflicts throughout as well. And I did my master's degree mostly on this region, so I was initially coming at it from pretty well steeped in that academic sort of conflict studies side of it.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, then over the course of it here, I mean, I didn't really start doing journalism, let's say, until probably about early 2018, I guess. Well, that's shortly after I got here, but yeah, sometime in 2018. And then I really, I focused a lot on, I was always focused on the political, ethnic minorities, tensions, this aspect of things mostly. But still, at the same time, there was I don't think anyone was really, we all knew it could happen, this second Karabakh war, but I don't think anyone really expected it to be, the full thing at any point. I think we all thought that it would be something like in 2016, they would fight for a few days, Russia would step in, put an end to it, and, they would go back to the negotiations table. But, for me and to just about everyone else, for it to be just the full scale second war was pretty shocking.
Mm-hmm. Did you find yourself in near the front lines, or have interviewed anybody who is directly involved with the conflict in that way?
Yeah, so I myself was in Karabakh for about 4 full days in the middle of the war last year. I guess that would have been I guess on the about 72 hours. I guess that was on the Sunday, the 11th of October last year. I got in, and then Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, full days there, and then out on Wednesday. And
Can you
so
tell us about that? Tell us can you describe like your first day going out there? How did you feel? Like, what were you, how did you get there? All these, it's an interesting story. So I'm sure, yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, it was extremely surreal, and it still sort of is to think back on. I mean, so when the war started here, various COVID related reasons, I had gone back to Canada for a few months, and then I was in Istanbul actually when the war started on the Sunday the 27th, and I basically spent, woke up on Sunday, spent all day on my phone, looking at news, giving interviews to various places, trying to figure out what's going on. Monday was the same thing, and then Tuesday I was already getting the thought, that this is not just a few days thing, and then we're done, and maybe I'll go back there. And then Wednesday I was on the plane back to Armenia, and then Thursday I was trying to get into Karabakh, and we landed on the Thursday night there, in Yerevan. That was meeting up with some of my local journalist friends, and that's the day where there was the reports, the videos of the drones being shot down about 20 kilometers north of Yerevan in Armenia proper. So this was like everyone was wondering what the hell was going on. What's the even the limits of this conflict? Is it seems to, if this is happening near Yerevan, like this is different even than just Karabakh. And then, for the next, we went down to near the border the next day, spent about, 2-3 full days trying to get in Karabakh. And the roads were just clogged with civilian vehicles, emergency vehicles, ambulances rushing from the front line back to hospitals in Armenia, tank loaders, artillery being transported, troop transports heading into Karabakh. And the bombardment was but the first day we were trying to go down there, we were about 2 hours from the border when we had to stop because the Azerbaijanis had used the ballistic missiles to take out one of the main bridges going into Karabakh from Armenia. And so we spent about 48 hours, fruitlessly trying to get in. Then at a point where the bombardment, the artillery bombardment on Stepanakert, the capital of Karabakh, was so heavy that they were actively bringing journalists out. And so it wasn't until about a week later that we did manage to get in. And that was sort of an eerie calm the first day. We're going in there, and there was very little shelling on Stepanakert that day, the 11th. Whereas the day before, we were told that the shelling was so heavy that the walls of the hotel were shaking. And then we're there, and Stepanakert was just this ghost town where I'd been there before the war too, and it's actually a very well developed, modernized city. There's been a lot of money that's been poured in there by the Armenian diaspora to build it up over the years, and so to see it with no one on the streets except for the occasional military vehicle or truckload of guys heading off to the front was very surreal. And then the other thing was, you get the air raid sirens every now and then, and the drones. You could hear the drones buzzing above you, some distance up in the sky, because essentially the Azeris had air superiority for the entirety of the conflict, and so that there was this constant, it was a different war in that sense. You're not worried about small arms fire or mortars or something, but you're aware that they have access to whatever targets they want already. And I guess the in Stepanakert itself, where I based those 3 days, it was pretty quiet those days, But then one day we went to the town of Martuni, which is in the northeast, or in the east, I guess, a few kilometers from the front line, and we could hear the artillery duels going on about five or so kilometers away. And but after we got there and we got out of the car, about 2 minutes after, we're talking with the officials and the local administration, and about 2 minutes after that, just short a split second whine and this huge crash, and the Azeris opened up on it with rocket artillery on the city while we were there. So that was probably the hairiest moment. And at that point, I had done basically the three locations that we were going to be allowed to go: Stepanakert, Shushi, which was later taken by the Azeris, and then Martuni, and then I left Karabakh and ended up doing the rest of the war from in Armenia itself. Sure. After that.
Mm-hmm. What's the situation like today? I mean, how did this? Obviously, it has not ended, right? But it's calmed down, or it's plateaued. In terms of how these conflicts tend to unfold, I'm not sure what the best word is to use in this situation. So please.
Yeah, I mean, the situation since the ceasefire on the early morning hours of November 10th last year has been, with exceptions, of course, but has been calm, let's say, because the Russians have been preparing for this for some time. I mean, within an hour of the ceasefire being signed, there was huge amounts of Russian military vehicles streaming into Karabakh. And the Russians officially have deployed 2,000 peacekeepers, but then, all sorts of couple thousand more auxiliary personnel and servicemen of different descriptions in Karabakh there. And they have fully taken control of the situation there. And they're on the front lines, working together with both the Armenians and the Azeris, and, keeping a very tight lid on the whole situation, and basically have set in stone, at least for the time being, what the current situation is. And so now, I mean, Karabakh is the most jarring thing about it is that the war was ended by the Russians. The Russians forced an end to it after the Azerbaijanis took the city of Shushi, or is area called Shusha, which is it's like this natural fortress perched high above everywhere else in Karabakh. It's only about 5 kilometers from the capital, Stepanakert, but it's about 600, 800 meters above it. And so you drive past it when you're going to Karabakh from Armenia, where you're going to Stepanakert. You drive past it and you can see it from Stepanakert. And now the Azeris have it. And it's just sort of and you drive past the Azeri soldiers there, and their special forces get up with their huge flags like Azerbaijan, Karabakh is ours. And there's this immense just psychological pressure you get just seeing that, and it gives you this feeling of just Stepanakert is like this place under siege almost, despite the fact the peacekeeping forces are there. But it's unavoidable, the sense of just the oppression of the Azeris being right there, right beside the capital.
Fascinating. This might be a little bit of a sophomore question, but talk to me about Russia's involvement versus NATO involvement. Tell me how you felt about, I guess Russia being the peacekeeping force. Is it because they were the only ones that were actively willing to engage as a peacekeeping force? Is it because it wants to exert its hegemony in the region? Is it both?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely both. I mean, the Russians, this was one of the sort of funny things about the war, is that everyone spent, myself included, 44 days saying, where are the Russians? Like they're getting embarrassed here because Turkey's come in and aided Azerbaijan in restarting this conflict, and then increasingly scoring a huge victory for its ally in the region. And the Russians were seemingly nowhere to be seen. They were bargaining with both sides, but the ceasefires they were broken weren't working and everything. And then all of a sudden, at the end, the Russians come in there, and they now have what they wanted since the end of the first war, they consistently tried to get, which was troops on the ground. And so now Russia, for the first time since the end of I guess let's let's say for the first time in over 10 years, 10 or 15 years, they have troops on the territory of all three South Caucasus republics.
Wow.
And so now this was the other two frozen conflicts in the South Caucasus in Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Those both border Russia, so Russia's had full control of those and military presence there for a long time, but it didn't in Karabakh, and now it does. So my view is essentially what happened was Karabakh, or what's left of it, went from being an Armenian protectorate to now it's a Russian one. And again, yeah, the Russians were they were essentially the only option to stop the fighting, because no one else was going to put troops in on the ground, or like had the contacts, or the leverage to be able to enforce this either. I mean, the end of the war came about because the Russians told the Azeris, we'll let you take Shushi, but after that, we're not going to let you take Stepanakert. So if you have to stop after that, or we will intervene militarily against you, and we will stop you. And Russia's the only international actor that could have credibly made that threat in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
So for the Russians, they were sort of the only game in town for sure at that point. Turkey tried to get involved, and they still try to get involved, but they've been largely boxed out of it. And yeah, what we're left with is Russia, more than ever holding all the cards with this conflict.
Interesting. Did you see, or have you heard of anything, or know of the reporting, or maybe report on anything that I guess stands out as an anomaly in terms of this conflict? Like, could be anything, particular human rights violations, particularly interesting private forces that might have gotten involved. I mean, a lot of times there are, especially with Russia, this Wagner Group situation, they've gotten involved in a variety of different places. Was this a breeding ground for any of that, any nefarious activity?
I mean, there were a few notorious things. I mean, there were some there were a number of horrific human rights violations and war crimes in this conflict. Mostly just because the level of hatred is just so astronomically high.
But those came as a result of military activity, correct?
True. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Of course, there was the Syrian mercenaries that were involved in this, which was, a very strange addition to this that no one expected, because it didn't really make much sense, and they didn't really prove much effectiveness. These are the same sort of guys that Turkey uses in conflicts, well, in Syria, but in Libya, where it's militias fighting each other, but state on state armies like this, it's a very different environment.
So what happened here? These were Syrian-backed militias that were already fighting in the Syrian conflict that made their way to this region to fight in the conflict.
Yeah, so these are essentially, Turkey over the last couple of years, and northern Syria has taken direct control of a few stretches of Syrian territory, Syrian opposition-held territory, sure, and rearmed and reformulated a number of the opposition groups there to essentially act as its own proxy forces, and pays them and everything, and so is able to utilize these. They've sent these guys to Libya before to support their side there. Mm-hmm. And so for this conflict, Turkey itself transferred several hundred of them, or several thousand, to Azerbaijan, and they employed them on the front lines there, essentially throwing these guys into the fight.
Wow. And you said that their effectiveness did not stand out. I mean, were they just there for a short time and then they were sent home? Was that what happened?
I mean, the only real indications we have of them, directly participating, the videos we have of them directly in action are from, let's say, the first 2 weeks, where the Azeris were still trying to break through the first main Armenian defensive line, and which is in the middle of pretty open ground there. And so these guys were just essentially, as far as we can tell, just thrown to the meat grinder there, and with pre-sighted artillery raining down on them and everything. And a lot of these guys thought they'd be doing guard duty or something. They were told that when they're going to Azerbaijan, they'd be doing guard duty or something like that. And so the guys, the Syrians themselves, were pretty surprised by this. And after those first 2 weeks, there's not much tangible that we hear about them. So I think they were mostly, they were supposed to participate in other offensives later in the war too, which they may have done. But let's say their first initial their main task, as far as we can tell, was essentially to serve as that first very expendable wave of infantry, basically, that you're throwing into the gap there to keep up pressure, see if there's a weak point so you can exploit with the actual Azerbaijani army and special forces afterwards.
Yeah, I'm curious. I wonder if that changed how things were developing on the front in Syria against like the YPJ and all those forces. I mean, removing some of those Syrian militias seems like it would probably, especially if they were in the thousands, seems like it would have a significant effect.
I mean, in Syria, the front lines have largely been static for the last couple of years now, and especially in the areas where these guys are being drawn from.
Right. Okay.
The Turkish army itself is in there,
Sure.
so there's not, and that whole area in northern Syria is basically run through mutual understanding between Russia and Turkey, anyways.
Right. What can you tell us about what's happening now? I mean, is this now continuing into is this a political war now? What's going on? What's the latest?
Well, what's happening, let's say, for the last 6 months is Azerbaijan is increasingly trying to pressure Armenia to come to the table and essentially just sign a comprehensive peace deal where Armenia completely relinquishes any pretenses of Karabakh and completely relinquishes the Karabakh issue, says we recognize Karabakh as a part of Azerbaijan and you win, essentially 100%. And so this has taken the form of, Azerbaijan has, about 6 months ago, it launched a few incursions into the Republic of Armenia itself, and in a few different areas set up positions several kilometers within Armenia's borders, and it's still hold up there. They increased pressure in other areas. They really ratcheted up the cross-border shootings in a number of other border areas, and especially in the south in the last 2 months, because of the way that the Soviet era borders were drawn, where it didn't matter whether a road crosses the border between two provinces of the same country, but because of the way this is played out now, that's this border, which was the areas that were controlled by Armenia from the early 90s until last fall. Now some of them they're back under Azerbaijani control, and so there's small sections of the main north-south highway in Armenia that Azerbaijan actually controls, and so they've clamped down on this. They've been detaining drivers that are going through there, truck drivers coming from Iran, which uses that road, and they've been trying to increase pressure there too. And in terms of Karabakh itself, the Karabakh issue itself, I mean, it's been, the Azeris are trying different ways to try and pressure people to make it unlivable and force the population to emigrate, either by shootings on the border, just Azeri snipers shooting at Karabakh Armenian civilians, or there's been big water and electricity shortages in Karabakh because they lost a lot of their water and electricity supply as a result of the war. And so this is another thing that Azerbaijan is doing, is they would like to just essentially force the population of Karabakh to emigrate to such a degree that whatever's left becomes less and less significant.
Yeah, interesting. How difficult is it for you to travel between those borders, especially being based on the Armenian side?
I mean, I think it'll be. I think it's.
Is it unheard of? I mean, what are international journalists doing now?
I think it'll be very difficult for me, at least, to ever visit Azerbaijan unless conditions change, because Azerbaijan is already very strict on its blacklist and its controls for international journalists. And especially if you've been to Karabakh, it decreases your chances a lot. But actually getting into Karabakh itself now is, for the last 8 months, extremely difficult, almost impossible for foreign journalists, because the Russians cracked down on it hard. The Russians, who control the only entrance into Karabakh, which comes from Armenia, they are not allowing foreign journalists largely to enter there now. So it's extremely difficult to access Karabakh even as well.
what is the footprint of Western or international journalism there? I mean, I guess I want to lead this into a little bit of a segue from some of the things I've read. I know you've been a bit critical of some of the larger publications, larger reporting that's happened there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean I think especially earlier in the war, the first 2 weeks there was there was a lot of false equivalency and just incidents that I thought didn't reflect a proper understanding of what was actually happening, or didn't reflect a proper picture of what was actually happening. The main one I think of is when Armenia launched strikes on a city in Azerbaijan, Ganja, and this was immediately reported as Armenia strike civilian targets, but exclusively as that, without mentioning lower on, if at all, that Azerbaijan had been doing the same thing indiscriminately for the last 2 weeks. And I think after that, the quality of international journalism on the region got generally fairly good. And especially in the immediate post-war period, once there was just semi-chaos and you could really go anywhere and the conflict was over, the active fighting was over. So there was a lot more access to be had. There was a lot of quite good reporting done then. And then since, let's say, earlier this year, the situation has gone back to largely what it was before the war, which very little presence of international media, because there's not that much happening, frankly, at the moment, and also access issues, especially on the Armenian side, trying to enter Karabakh itself. There's been some journalists who have gone into the territories that Azerbaijan recaptured from the Azeri side and have done some great reporting. But that's also difficult because Azerbaijan very tightly controls the access to that as well. So it has become quite difficult to do on the ground reporting from Karabakh itself.
Mm-hmm. I tend to always ask this of my guests. Is there anything that you can think of that, we should be asking, or that we're missing about this? I mean, I guess I always just ask that question as a control, and maybe there isn't, or maybe there isn't a great answer, but I don't know. How do you? What's your reaction when I ask that question? I guess this is the best way to ask it.
Yeah, I mean, I think just the one fact that's often the elephant in the room, but that people for some reason, sure, it's like people have a tendency to want to approach it as one side bad, other side bad.
Sure.
Which is understandable. Start from a point of neutrality, but the ultimate fact that I think is pretty undeniable is that if the rest of Karabakh ever comes under Azerbaijan's control, it'll be completely depopulated, and everyone else there, however that happens, everyone there is no hope for the Armenian population of Karabakh to exist under Azerbaijan's rule. I mean, as we've seen in this war, with about 30% of the former Karabakh province that was captured by Azerbaijan, it's completely ethnically cleansed. Every civilian who was there was driven out during the war, and the ones that stayed behind were executed. And those settlements are empty today, and that will be the fate of the entire region if it's ever transferred somehow, either diplomatically or militarily, to Azerbaijan's control. I mean, it'll just be the complete population cleansing of the region. And I think that's a pretty it's something that we all know, but a lot of people don't really like to say it, or it's easy to move to ignore that. And I mean, for that very reason, there's really no just outcome to this, in my mind, that involves Azerbaijan winning, let's say, by gaining control over the remainder of this territory. Azerbaijan got back the other 7 regions, that were undisputed territory before the war. It has all those regions back, and there is no real moral argument, I don't think, for why Azerbaijan needs or should be allowed to take control of the rest of Karabakh, given the mass tragedy that will ensue.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting developing situation, but I'm happy that you were able to join this morning and give us a bit of a brief look. I know 45 minutes is never long. I don't even know if we stayed on so long, but the world depends on experts like yourself and the reporting from those front lines. So really appreciate your work, and thank you very much. If you'd like to, please plug your social media and your Patreon and where we can find your reporting and everything else.
Yeah, so the best way to follow me is on Twitter at twitter.com/Neil P. Hauer, NeilPhauer. And then there too, you can find the link to my Patreon, which is patreon.com/Neil Hauer, where I provide weekly newsletter to patrons and access to additional early versions of my reporting, and a lot of behind the scenes stuff that I learn in my day-to-day work that it's going to give you extra insight on the region you're not going to find elsewhere. So yeah, check out Twitter and via that my Patreon.
Awesome. Hey, thank you so much. Really appreciate you. Thanks again for joining.
Thanks for having me on, Jody.
Cheers.